Hello and welcome to Conway Video. So in this video I want to talk about flaky or brittle unit tests and what I think is the number one or one of the best ways that you can overcome this problem and make your tests less brittle and less flaky. So let's get into it. So what's the problem we're trying to solve here? So the problem is that we have unit tests or maybe integration tests or other kinds of tests which are flaky or brittle. So when we say flaky or brittle, what we mean is that those tests seem to break very frequently and they give us false alarms. They tell us that something's gone wrong when actually it hasn't. We just made an innocent, normal sort of change to our application, to our code, but all of a sudden all these tests are breaking that shouldn't be breaking. Now, code is the sort of thing that it doesn't necessarily all change all the time, but sometimes there are parts of the code that might be changing a lot and might be in flux. And so what we want to do is prevent those changes from causing our tests to break. And I think that we have to look at the reason why the tests are breaking. And I think one of the big reasons is that a lot of unit tests are over-specified. They're way too specific. So, for example, if a user clicks a button before they've entered text into a text field and we want an error message to be shown, a test is often a bit too brittle if it goes really specific about what that specific text should be, where it should be on the screen, or something like that. And often the way that around this problem is actually to make the test a bit more general. Not in so general that it's not meaningful, and this is the thing, it has to be a meaningful test. It has to be a test that if the thing really is broken, then it really does trigger as being false, because we want our tests to obviously fail if something does go wrong. But I think the way then to go about this is to, rather than over specify a test, is to right specify a test. So make it just specific enough, but not too specific. Now this can be a bit of a tricky thing. I think there's a bit of an art to this. It's not a pure science. I don't think it's something that you can automate or something that you can have a rule that you just follow that rule and you're always going to end up with a test that is perfectly well specified. But I think it comes down to an understanding of probably a bit of experience with this and unit testing and with how you specify them, and also an understanding of the business logic and the intention, what you're trying to do with the test. If you're trying to maybe give the user a bit of guidance or a bit of help, then you might have one kind of test written in one kind of way. If you, on the other hand, are trying to enforce a very important business rule, maybe it's to do with authorization, you're trying to make sure that only authorized users can access a given resource, you might want a test that's a lot more strict and a lot more rigorous. Again, that doesn't have to mean the test is over-specified. The test doesn't have to be super specific about exactly what kind of user this is and exactly how they're logging in and exactly what they're trying to access. It just has to be specific enough to capture the intent of the piece of code that you're testing. And so what I find interesting about this is that you don't necessarily need to put things like error messages or text messages or things like that into the test. You might actually just be able to assert that there is a string or there is a piece of text in the UI in this kind of format or in this part of the UI, and just leave it at that. And that means that if you have to go ahead and change that at some time in the future, maybe you have to change that element, maybe you have to change the text, then your test is still going to pass, because your test is written in a way that it's just general enough that it's not going to be flaky when those specific things change. But again, what are those things? How do you make your test right specified rather than over specified? And I think it's a bit of an art, and as much as it is a science. It's not an exact thing that you can follow the same rule. If there was some rule that you could follow with every single test, then I guess the same would be true of the code that you're testing, and then you would be able to program by rules, and then you wouldn't have to do your job. Some kind of software would do it for you. It would be automated, and maybe one day we'll get to that sort of place as an industry. But I think before we do, we have to work with what we've got at the moment, which is that we have a certain element of human judgment about what the software is trying to do, what the behavior is that we want, And then out of that behavior, we just need to have that, I guess, that extra layer on in our head that says, hang on, before I go and write this test and make it super specific and super hardwired and soldered into the way that this code works, how about I step back a bit and see if I can make this test just a little bit more general? It doesn't have to be completely general, but just a little bit more general in such a way that this thing can change without breaking the test. Some details about it can change, whether that's the color something is, whether that's the text something has, whether that's even maybe some of the specifics of the business rule that we're trying to, verify. Look for some specifics that can change, and then write the test in such a way that it's not so coupled to that specific thing. And I think that can be a good recipe for writing unit tests that are not brittle, but are going to be able to work with the code in whatever way that the code ends up changing. So yeah, that's my thought, I guess, about writing unit tests that are less brittle and less likely to break when code changes. I guess to take this further, I'm going to be interested in researching open source libraries out there that might be able to help with this sort of thing. I think there are already a lot of features actually built into current testing frameworks. A lot of testing frameworks allow you to verify the type that something is, so whether it's, say, a string or a number or a boolean and so on. Some testing frameworks even go a step further and let you specify things like ranges or lengths of strings and that sort of thing. I think that can be useful. I'd be interested to see them evolve a bit further, or maybe that new libraries come out that support things like saying, I want to specify that this string should be a message to the user that tells them to do something, for example. So you could do some kind of linguistic analysis or something on the text. Or you could say, like, I expect this to be a warning of some kind. I don't want to specify exactly what the warning says. I just want to say that it should be a warning, that if the user tries to do X, Y, and Z, some kind of warning of some kind should be shown. And maybe these can even evolve into, like, asserting things about the graphics or the look and feel of an interface, although that might be a little bit more tricky to test. But I think at the very least it would be interesting to see how frameworks and libraries evolve with just normal everyday things like dealing with strings, dealing with, or things like maybe response times. So, I think that this thing should take, say, 5 seconds to 20 seconds to complete. So giving it a range of time to complete and then failing if it doesn't complete within that time. Again, instead of making the test really specific and having a timeout, you try and give it a certain sort of range. Or another thing might be that you might have a representative sample of data that is kind of just sampled from the kind of data your application normally expects to have. And then that sample of data, you use that to build a heuristic, and then the test uses that heuristic to decide whether something kind of looks right or kind of looks wrong. And so I think what I'm thinking about, I guess, are different ways of making tests more flexible, more malleable, more amorphous in a way. So less sort of bound to concrete specific values, like, this particular string that says this field is required, or, this particular label that says submit on a button, but having it a little bit more flexible than that, so that you can change those specific details about a user interface or about an application without the test failing every time you change that, and then you having to go back and fix the test all the time. Because I think the last thing we want, and most programmers can agree on this, is that we don't want test code that just reproduces our regular code. What's the point of that? Then we're having to write all our logic on all our code just twice, and what writing code twice doesn't do anyone any good. So we want our tests to be really written as tests. They shouldn't be written as the code that they're testing with all that specific kind of concrete logic, but they should be written in a much more general way to say, okay, I have confidence that this thing works properly if I see this and this and this happening. I'm not going to say that exactly this has to happen, exactly that has to happen. I'm just going to say that if I load up this web page and it takes 3 seconds to load, and I see this kind of thing and this kind of thing, then I kind of know that this thing works. And so I think that may be the future, or one of the future directions of unit testing in terms of making tests more brittle. But anyway, that's my video, and that's my thoughts about making unit tests less brittle by right specifying things and avoiding over specification. Thanks for watching.